She was only 14, too young to carry a weapon, too ordinary to attract suspicion. Riding a bicycle through occupied streets, she looked like just another child trying to survive the war. But hidden beneath that innocence was one of the deadliest roles of World War II and feat anti-World War II resistance. Her bicycle did not fire bullets. It carried something far more dangerous. Messages at timing. Death within months. Nazi officers began dying in places they believed were secure. Barracks, not cafes. Headquarters. The pattern made no sense until historians looked closer. This is the true story of how a teenage girl, underestimated by everyone, turned an everyday bicycle into a weapon that helped kill dozens of Nazi officers. If you value real history told responsibly, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you're watching from. In occupied Europe, survival often depended on being invisible. The Nazis controlled cities with checkpoints, patrols, curfews, and fear. Adults were questioned. Young men were searched. Resistance fighters were hunted relentlessly. But children moved through this world differently. They were seen as harmless. Useful, sometimes. Dangerous, never. That assumption would cost the occupying forces dearly. The girl at the center of this story was 14 years old when the war swallowed her hometown. German flags hung from government buildings. Boots echoed through narrow streets. Radios whispered propaganda. Food was scarce. Trust was scarcer. Like many families, hers learned quickly that silence was safer than protest. She had grown up riding her bicycle everywhere. To school, to markets, along back roads and alleys most soldiers ignored. The bicycle was old, repaired many times, its metal frame dull and scratched. It did not look important. Neither did the girl. That was precisely why the resistance noticed her. Underground networks across Europe faced a constant problem. Communication. Radios could be tracked. Messengers were arrested. Written notes meant death if discovered. The resistance needed couriers who could move naturally, without raising suspicion, and who could remember information without writing it down. Children were risky, but they were also overlooked. At first, her role was simple. Ride from one address to another. Deliver bread, carry medicine, pass along verbal messages that sounded like ordinary errands. She was told never to ask questions, never to repeat anything twice, never to write anything down. If stopped, she was to smile, act confused, and say she was late for her mother. She did exactly that. German soldiers waved her through checkpoints without searching the bicycle. Officers ignored her entirely. She learned which streets were watched, which times were safest, and which soldiers were careless. Without realizing it, she was building a mental map of occupation. As the resistance trusted her more, the tasks changed. She was no longer just carrying messages. She was carrying information that shaped operations. Schedules, meeting times, names, locations of officers who followed predictable routines. Cafes where German commanders gathered. Buildings used as temporary headquarters. Barracks with weak security. The bicycle became essential. Inside the frame, beneath the seat, hidden in the handle grips, the resistance sometimes concealed micro-notes or small components. Other times, she carried nothing physical at all, only memorized details delivered with absolute precision. One mistake could unravel an entire cell. She understood the stakes, even if she did not fully understand the scale. Nazi officers began dying under mysterious circumstances. Bombs detonated where meetings were supposed to be secret. Assassinations occurred minutes after carefully timed arrivals. Traps were set with impossible accuracy. German intelligence blamed rival units, poor discipline, or internal leaks. They never suspected the girl on the bicycle. Her age protected her. Her routine protected her. Her calm protected everyone else, but the work took a toll. Each ride carried fear. Each checkpoint forced her to control her breathing. She saw bodies in the streets, heard screams from buildings she passed every day. She learned that information could kill just as surely as a gun. And still, she rode. What made her bicycle so deadly was not explosives or weapons. It was timing, precision, the ability to move faster than suspicion. In modern terms, she was a human delivery system for coordinated resistance operations. Operations that would lead to the deaths of dozens of Nazi officers over time. Not all at once, not in one dramatic moment, but cumulatively, relentlessly. She never saw most of the results directly. That was intentional. The resistance shielded couriers from knowledge that could break them under interrogation. She would deliver a message in the morning, ride home by afternoon, and hear distant explosions hours later without knowing if she was connected. Sometimes she knew. Sometimes she rode past buildings that no longer stood. The bicycle tires wore down. Her legs grew stronger. Her face remained young. And the Nazis continued to underestimate her. That mistake would not last forever. As the occupation tightened and German losses mounted, suspicion grew. Checkpoints became harsher. Random searches increased. The margin for error shrank to nothing. And one ordinary ride would push her closer to discovery than ever before. By the time the girl turned 15, the war around her had changed. The occupation had grown more violent, more desperate. German officers no longer moved with confidence. They traveled in groups. They changed routes. They trusted no one. Too many of their own had been killed without warning, and no clear enemy could be found. The resistance, however, understood exactly why. Operations were becoming more complex. No longer were they isolated strikes or single acts of sabotage. They were coordinated actions involving multiple cells, timed down to minutes. And at the center of that coordination were couriers, human links holding everything together. The girl on the bicycle was no longer just useful. She was critical. Her missions expanded. She was now riding longer distances, sometimes across towns she had never visited before. She memorized officer schedules, vehicle movements, and meeting confirmations. A nod from one contact meant confirmed. A delayed arrival meant abort. Everything depended on precision. The bicycle allowed her to move faster than foot patrols and quieter than vehicles. It blended into the background of occupied life. German soldiers still waved her through, though now with less patience. Some began asking questions. Where was she going? Why was she out so late? Why did she ride the same route so often? She learned to lie convincingly. She talked about sick relatives, about food shortages, about school assignments that no longer existed. She complained just enough to seem ordinary. Fear became something she carried silently, never allowing it to reach her face. But the danger was growing. One afternoon, she arrived at a safe house to deliver a routine confirmation. The door did not open immediately. When it finally did, the man inside was shaking. He told her not to return that way again. 2 resistance members had been arrested the night before. One had talked. Names were compromised. The network was shrinking. Despite the risk, operations continued. Nazi officers were still being targeted, sometimes through assassinations, other times through bombings timed precisely to meetings she had confirmed hours earlier. Cafes she passed daily became scenes of destruction. Headquarters she rode past vanished overnight. She began to understand the weight of what she was doing. The bicycle was no longer just transport. It was a moving fuse. German counterintelligence intensified efforts to uncover how information was leaking. Checkpoints multiplied. Random bicycle inspections began. Tires were poked. Frames were tapped. Soldiers checked under seats and inside baskets. The resistance adapted quickly. Messages became entirely verbal. Nothing written, nothing hidden. The girl was trained to memorize sequences of numbers, times, and locations as if they were poems. She repeated them silently while riding, afraid that a sudden distraction might erase everything. Sleep became difficult. Every dream ended with boots and shouting. One evening, her luck nearly ran out. At a checkpoint she had passed dozens of times before, a young German soldier stopped her and asked her to dismount. He looked nervous, new, uncertain. That made him dangerous. He asked where she was going. She gave the usual answer. He did not believe her. Another soldier approached, older, tired. He glanced at her bicycle, at her face, at the line of traffic forming behind them. After a moment, he waved her through impatiently. She rode away slowly until she turned the corner, then pedaled as fast as she could without drawing attention. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly lost control. That night, the resistance made a decision. She was too valuable to lose, and the risk had become unacceptable. Her role would change again. Instead of moving constantly, she would become a final link, used only when success or failure depended on perfect timing. Fewer missions, higher stakes. One mistake could collapse entire operations. The next assignment would be her most dangerous yet. She was told only what she needed to know. A meeting of high-ranking Nazi officers. A location believed to be secure. A narrow window of time. Her job was to confirm attendance and deliver the signal that would trigger the operation. She rode that day knowing something would happen because of her. When she passed the building hours later, it still stood. When she returned home, she heard nothing. Only late that night did the explosion echo across the city, rattling windows and waking neighbors. The next morning, German patrols flooded the streets. Officers were furious. Arrests followed. Curfews tightened. Posters appeared warning of executions for anyone aiding the resistance. The girl saw one of those posters while riding her bicycle. She did not stop. By then, dozens of Nazi officers had been killed through operations she had helped make possible. Not by her hands, but by her courage, memory, and refusal to be seen as harmless. Yet with every success, the danger grew closer. German intelligence was no longer asking how the resistance communicated. They were asking who could move through the city unnoticed. And for the first time, children were on their list. By the time Part 3 begins, the city was no longer pretending the war was distant. German patrols were everywhere. Trucks rolled through narrow streets at all hours. Boots echoed in stairwells before dawn. Neighbors spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. Anyone could disappear overnight, and many did. The resistance felt the pressure immediately. Safe houses were abandoned without explanation. Familiar faces stopped appearing. Messages became shorter, more cautious. The network was contracting again, pulling inward to survive. And the girl on the bicycle was running out of invisibility. German intelligence had identified a pattern. Information was leaking too quickly, too accurately. Meetings were being compromised within hours. Routes were exposed before plans were finalized. Someone was moving freely, unnoticed, connecting points that should not have connected. They began watching the streets differently. Children were no longer ignored. The girl noticed it first in small ways. A soldier staring a second too long. A patrol that seemed to follow her for half a block before turning away. A checkpoint that appeared unexpectedly on a road she had used for months without trouble. She adjusted instinctively. She changed routes constantly. She rode slower. Sometimes she doubled back for no reason at all, just to see who reacted. She learned to read reflections in shop windows. She listened for footsteps behind her wheels. Fear was no longer an emotion. It was a constant state. Her next assignment came with almost no details. That alone was alarming. She was told only this: deliver confirmation to a contact at a bakery near the river. If the contact was not there by a specific time, she was to leave immediately and never return to that location again. That meant arrests were expected. She rode there at midday, when crowds were thick enough to hide her. The bakery was busy, the smell of bread filling the street. Inside, she waited, pretending to examine pastries she could not afford. The contact arrived late. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her. He placed his hand briefly on the counter and left. That was the signal. She exited through the back door and mounted her bicycle, heart racing. As she pedaled away, she felt it. Certainty, cold and sharp. She was being followed. Not openly, not aggressively, but the rhythm behind her was wrong. Too steady, too intentional. She turned onto a side street. The sound followed. She slowed near a row of parked carts. The sound slowed too. There was no panic. Panic wasted energy. She did exactly what she had been trained to do. She rode straight to a market square crowded with civilians and dismounted. She leaned her bicycle against a wall and disappeared into the crowd on foot. Minutes passed. She emerged on the opposite side of the square and retrieved her bicycle from where she had hidden it earlier that morning. She rode home by a route she had never used before. That night, she did not sleep. The next morning, German soldiers arrived at her building. They were not there for her. Not yet. They questioned neighbors. They searched apartments. They asked about anyone unusual, anyone who traveled often, anyone who rode a bicycle regularly. Her mother answered calmly. So did the neighbors. The soldiers left. But the message was clear. The city was closing in. The resistance met in person for the first time in weeks. That alone signaled urgency. The decision was debated fiercely. Some argued she should be removed immediately, sent to the countryside, hidden until the war ended. Others disagreed. There was one final operation underway, a major one. High-ranking officers, tight timing, no margin for error. Without her, it might fail. She listened silently as adults argued about her life. When they finally asked her opinion, she answered without hesitation. She would finish the mission. The plan required her to ride across the city during an active security alert. Curfews were tightening. Patrols were aggressive. Any mistake would be fatal. She was given one instruction above all others. If captured, she was to say nothing. Not names, not places, not reasons. The morning of the mission, she rode past posters announcing executions for resistance activity. She recognized one of the names. She did not stop. At the rendezvous point, she confirmed what she needed to confirm. She delivered the signal. As she turned away, a truck screeched to a halt behind her. A voice shouted. She did not look back. She rode. Shots were not fired. They wanted her alive. She cut through alleys, down slopes, across bridges. Her legs burned. Her breath tore at her chest. She ignored it all. At the edge of the city, she abandoned the bicycle and ran. By nightfall, the operation she had enabled was complete. The target was destroyed. Officers were dead. Chaos spread through the command structure. But the girl was gone. German intelligence searched for weeks. Her description was circulated. Her routes were mapped. They never found her, because she was no longer where they were looking. The city never learned her name. In the weeks after her disappearance, German command issued furious orders. Curfews tightened. Bicycles were inspected. Children were questioned in schools. Entire neighborhoods were searched again and again, as if repetition alone could force the truth to surface. Nothing worked. The resistance knew what had happened the moment the operation succeeded. The explosion did not just eliminate officers. It erased plans, disrupted supply lines, and delayed a major crackdown that would have cost hundreds of civilian lives. But victory came with a cost. The girl could not return. Her home was no longer safe. Her bicycle, once ordinary, was now a liability. The streets that had protected her anonymity had become traps. Within days, she was moved under cover of night. First to a farmhouse, then farther. Then across a border that no longer officially existed, only lines on maps ignored by people who had learned how fragile paper could be. To protect the network, she was erased. Her mother was told nothing. Not because she could not be trusted, but because love was dangerous under occupation. Grief was safer than knowledge. German records listed the incident as an internal security failure. No mention of a child. No acknowledgement of a bicycle. Just vague references to unknown partisan coordination. They never understood what had really happened. Because the most effective weapon used against them had been something they refused to see as a threat. A teenage girl. After liberation, investigators reconstructed what they could. Survivors spoke carefully, years later, in fragments. A courier, very young, unusually effective, always on a bicycle, always calm. But resistance networks were designed to forget. Names were not recorded. Faces were allowed to fade. That was how people survived. By the time historians began asking questions, the trail was cold. Files were incomplete. Witnesses were gone. Memory had done what bombs could not. It had buried the details. What remained were outcomes. Entire units missing at critical moments. officers dead in places deemed secure, arrests that never happened because warnings arrived just in time. All of it traced back to information that moved faster than it should have. That bicycle, it did not carry a bomb. It carried certainty. It carried schedules, confirmations, silent approvals. It carried the difference between walking into an ambush and avoiding it by minutes. It carried the weight of decisions made by people who never knew the face of the person who made them possible. Dozens of Nazi officers died, not because of a single act of violence, but because a system collapsed around them, piece by piece, under the pressure of intelligence they could not stop. And at the center of that system was a girl who understood something most adults never did. That invisibility could be power. She survived the war. Not everyone did. She lived quietly afterward, under a different name, in a different place. She did not give interviews. She did not attend commemorations. When asked about the war, she spoke of hunger, cold mornings, and riding long distances because there was nothing else to do. That was not a lie. It was simply incomplete. Only decades later did fragments surface. Enough to confirm the scale, but not the identity. Enough to understand the mechanism, but not the person. And maybe that was intentional, because her story was never meant to be about recognition. It was about how resistance actually worked. Not with grand speeches or famous leaders, but with ordinary people making impossible choices quietly, repeatedly, and without guarantees. A 14-year-old girl did not set out to kill anyone. She set out to deliver messages. History decided what those messages became. And in doing so, it reminds us of something uncomfortable and essential. Wars are not only shaped by armies and generals. Sometimes they are changed forever by someone the enemy never bothered to notice, until it was too late. This is not a story about violence. It is a story about courage disguised as routine, about how the smallest movements can create the largest consequences, and about a bicycle that carried far more than anyone could see.